This is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast, in which we fools attempt to bring ideas from philosophy and psychology to people who are interested in applying them in their own lives. I'm Boaz. I've been a founder and executive in renewable energy companies, and now I consult on transformation with various organizations.
Hi, folks. I'm Brian. Welcome back to Fools and Sages podcast. I am your host, your co-host, and a teacher, and a artist, and a builder, and a backyard philosopher.
Cool. Thanks, Brian. So today's question actually comes from a listener, which is a first, and
Very nice.
yeah, a fun new endeavor for us. And we've touched on aspects of it in prior episodes. The question is, how do we integrate trauma? And I talked to this listener a little bit, and one of the elements that we talked about was IFS. I don't know if you're familiar with that form of therapy, but the internal family system,
Oh,
where
interesting.
basically we recognize that there are parts of us that froze at various moments in time, and we learn to identify those parts, which might have a variety of names,
Yep.
and we learn to discover their needs and their characteristics.
Sure.
And that separates our adult self from the trauma in some interesting way that allows us to interact with our parts
Yep.
and
To work on it.
work on it. And interestingly, the parts can also include archetypes, which is an interesting twist.
Mhm.
But people I know that have gone through this process end up discovering like the wise old woman that lives inside
Mhm.
of them,
Absolutely.
and then that becomes a resource. So that's kind of one aspect we talked about. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what trauma is, and then how we might integrate it.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I think the place to start is to realize that life is trauma. That we may have an image of an ideal circumstance. I know that I sure do. What would my life have been like if you go back to the bad chapter and you say, "What if that chapter had been good?" And we can kind of be in a pre-hypnotized state around that idealized circumstance. And the tendency might be to compare that with our actual experience and diminish our understanding of the actual experience by that comparison. I don't know if I said that clear enough, but
Can
but
you explain it?
yeah, we don't wanna see our lives only as a broken version of what could have been,
Mm,
because that's a misconstrual, right? It's more like the mud that the lotus grows through, and the lotus won't grow without the mud. You'll notice that about lotuses. They're not just hanging out everywhere. And so we, in a similar way, it's almost like metaphysically for our perception to be relevant, we have to come through this. And that's a difficult thing to explain. These the traumas. Okay, here's a physical metaphor. In kung fu, you get injured occasionally. And as you age, right? The things go not go will imbalance with your bodily function. And the ways that that has happened to me have greatly increased my understanding of how the body works. If I had not experienced the trauma that I had, I would not understand the things that I understand, and I would not be the person that I am. And I also would not be the resource that I have been able to be on occasion to others. Uh, that might seem like a dingy silver lining when you're in the midst of your trauma, right? And it's attributed to the Buddha, although I don't think he ever said it. The saying is, "And this too shall pass." And he well could have said it, I think. Uh, but there is something to Nietzsche talked about this embracing our destiny. And there is an isness to trauma, particularly if it's not self-inflicted. So that it's not like like the universe is passing a judgment on you because of your actions. You were the passive recipient of this circumstance. This is your crossword puzzle. I used to have a lecture that I gave that was called "Every Life is a Koan." And in the Zen tradition, they would give you a riddle. I think I mentioned what my first koan was about the sound of the wood, or famous koans are what is the sound of one hand clapping, or what was your face before you were born, or a popular version might be why do I have no beard? Because that the famous version of that was why did Bodhidharma have no beard, who was the patriarch who brought Buddhism to China. Well, he wasn't the first one, but he was one of the early ones. And he clearly had a beard. And so the question became either why did the foreigner come from the West, or why did Bodhidharma have no beard? So, anyway, little digression there. I know the idea of embracing your trauma is it sounds ridiculous. It sounds like swallowing razor blades. But there is some way that we do have to go into it to it's like going into the dragon's lair to steal the pearl of wisdom. There is something there that is maybe a psychological dragon for us, and that's why trauma often takes. I mean, I've said this before. I didn't understand the effects of my trauma because it happened so early. I started to get clues in my late 40s, maybe mid 50s, before I kind of pieced together. And this is a thing that happens often with uh, children that are what they will often call abandoned children now in the modern literature. We used to call them orphans, and started calling them adopted children in the in between there. Uh, but there is a thing that happens there, whereas you spend a whole lot of your life saying everything's fine, there's no problems here, everything's fine, and you genuinely believe that because the stuff that's there needs to be uncovered and it needs to go through a process. But so, we have to be patient with ourselves. We have to realize that there is a time release function to the mind, the whole mind, not just the conscious mind, so that these things will bubble up or precipitate out. You pick your metaphor, but they happen over time and they happen as part of a process. And there is an inner intelligence about how we need to take these things to be able to integrate them and learn from them. And we kind of have to trust that capacity because, uh, you're alive. You made it through. So I love that song called Alive by Pearl Jam. That will be our rock and roll reference for the day. It's clearly about an adopted child. And the refrain is, well, you're alive. You're still alive, though, aren't you? Which is kind of what everybody tells you. That's the other half of your saying, yeah, everything's fine. Everything's fine. I'm still alive, you know, but something's wrong, and there's a process to get to work that out. And so, yeah, I love that song. "Hey, son, have I got a little story for you?" Right.
Um, yeah, and Eddie Vedder's great on that one.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe let's I don't know if I have a coherent definition of trauma. The way I think about it is stress that exists to an extent that we lose the ability to choose, to make choices. And when we lose the ability to make choices, we suppress or internalize the feelings that we're not allowed to have or the choices that we're not allowed to make. Those are interrelated, and bury them
Mhm.
as um and then
Both physically and psychologically.
yeah, and then that ends up playing out in limiting our access to choice later, either
Sure,
because our feelings are overwhelming or because we just don't see that our worldview is limited
sure.
by the beliefs that result from not having had choice. That's kind of how I
Absolutely.
think about it.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also we like to say that humans go through a developmental process, and I would rather say humans are a developmental process. Like, it's that deep, it's that fundamental to our nature, and so what that means is that when this trauma, however we define it, when it occurs in the story is significant. We spoke about chapters. So, the chapter of development that a trauma occurs in will affect the nature of the choices that are lost, to use that choice model. But a way that we can also see it is that, we didn't really somehow that chapter didn't get finished, or it got buggered up a little somehow. But the force of time and development means we still need to move forward. And so the next chapter is going to get put on top of it. And because that last chapter maybe wasn't entirely solid, then that may be felt through, like, the pee in the under the mattresses, right? It may be
Or
felt in
bowling ball.
say it again?
Could be a bowling ball too.
Could be a bowling ball, yeah, there's more mattresses, right?
It's one
And
step, yeah.
exactly, and yeah, so when that happens, it's going to be relevant to, and this is kind of like a troubleshooting thing, right? Because different chapters of development are about different things, right? The trauma that happened to me as a newborn was in the fundamental stages of the forming of a self in the experience of life, which is very different than it's if something happens later during, say, psychosexual development, where a lot of abuse happens. So, what Reich used to say is that one of the advantages that we have in therapy, and I say this in the broadest sense with life as therapy. I don't mean you have to sit down with a therapist. I mean the growth beyond trauma. Let's speak it that broadly. But the processes that you go through after, well, the way Reich would say it is that the natural impulses are always deeper and laid underneath whatever trauma occurred. And so that when we're working with somebody or ourselves, we know that those natural impulses, those choices are there still. We've just sort of temporarily lost access to them. And it is within the nature of a human that those are underneath. So Reich said it like those natural impulses are always deeper than whatever the trauma was. So, like, to jump across to shamanism, if you're working with a patient, those are the impulses that you might sing to, that are underneath there, that are going to, like, I've sat in front of people that had clearly gone through many difficult chapters. And and one in particular I can think of, and here was a woman that sat in front of me, and as I was singing to her, I got this flash of this little girl, this beautiful little girl. And it was so different. So much had happened. So much had piled on top that it was like a surprise to me, right? So that little girl was who I sang to, because even though that had been interrupted in those chapters, those natural elements were still there, right?
You know the phrase, "Apamwini almasito wawakuna"?
It doesn't ring a
Um,
bell, but
"Come here, little soul of the
mm,
baby."
okay. I
And
would use Noyasita for that.
uh-huh, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that I mean, that's a consistent, tactic, for sure, like
Yeah,
singing
yeah.
to the soul the baby soul inside the person, yeah.
Right, because God put in, or the creation of the universe, however you wanna, language that in semantic world, that those we know whatever your philosophical opinions about that, we know that here is that human. We know that child was a chapter that this person before us came through. And we know that those natural, forces that created this person were there in that child, were there expressing as a human. And so so I guess what I'm saying is that as a person, as a human with trauma, you always know you are underneath that.
Mm,
And so you can always be recovered. You will not disappear because of trauma that showed up. You might have difficulty showing up in some areas, but you are still there. And through the working out of that, through I mean, we like to say it is what it is, but what that kind of represents is an acceptance of saying I'm there for what is, and I'm gonna squeeze the juice out of it. Even though sometimes it looks like there's gnashing of teeth. I mean, it doesn't look like it. There
there is
is gnashing of teeth.
there's actual gnashing of teeth, yeah,
Actual gnashing of actual teeth. Yes.
yeah. So there's a few themes, I guess I'm gonna go to you just mentioned acceptance, and I wonder if you can say more about acceptance and maybe forgiveness in there too, self-forgiveness, forgiveness of other. Because part of what happens when we reduce choices is we often take responsibility, sometimes without even realizing it,
Mhm. Yep.
for the shit that went down. And so, like a
Totally.
consistent pattern with that is when the caretaking environment that we live in is chaotic at a certain age, we decide if the universe is that crazy a place, then I need to be responsible for making the universe a sane place. And then we end up carrying that sense of responsibility unconsciously for decades,
Yep.
right?
Or just I deserve the trauma that I received for some reason I don't understand.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
So yeah, acceptance, forgiveness, self-forgiveness. What are the levers there?
Well, I think that you did receive the trauma that you received because of who you were, and myself also, but not the way you think.
Right, right.
That's the devil is in the details here, literally.
Say more.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think that, and I don't wanna talk absolutist. I mean, I think this is a powerful model, whether we get into the absolute isness of things, and that is that what's on your plate is there for you. There's this interpretation, esoteric interpretation of the saying in the Bible that the sins of the father are visited upon the heads of the sons for 7 generations. And the esoteric interpretation of that is one that's sort of based in this idea of reincarnation. And it interprets this as the spirit being the father, the spirit being that is the face of you before you were born, to borrow the Zen koan, that the spirit was the impetus for the manifestation of the body, which is the son, and that the sins of the father are the imbalances of that spirit. through 7 generations, which they read as the chakras or as the what translates to the body segments in Reichian therapy, and that those sins, those imbalances, those blockages to pure God energy, pure universe creative force energy, become the fingerprint of who you are with the small y, who you are when you're not as God, when you're as small you. So so then in that model, as we as we clean up, we correspondingly wake up. And then that is who shows up. And I mean this on the big scale of traveling through lives is the model, right? And again, I'm just reporting it, right? Uh, but but so that model says that this is a model that includes the perfectibility of humankind. That says that we do get closer. We do. There is something to wake up to. There is a state we can clean up to. There is a grown state we're growing up to, right?
I think there's another reading of that image, the sins of the father being visited on the sons for 7 generations.
There's probably 7 of them.
Right. Yeah. But transgenerational trauma has always been really interesting to me because I think it's a phrase that gets misused and kind of misappropriated. But it's also a really interesting pattern that occurs. And like in the shamanic context, and tell me what you think of this. My model of it is that the original trauma, however far back you want to go, manifests in a set of lack of choice, which shows up as stories, behaviors, etc., that the child then experiences from the parent.
Yep. Attractions, aversions, and bewilderments
Yeah,
is
yeah,
how it
right.
shows up.
And so the traumatized child, the original traumatized child grows up and downloads the trauma to the child to their child through a set of lack of choice or bewilderments, etc.
Yep,
Behaviors, and so then that child picks up on it. And from
yep,
a shamanic standpoint, I can see the lack of choice as a spirit, a parasitic entity, right? That is limiting human capacity generation after generation. And in each generation, if we can clean it up some and get rid of the effects of that parasitic entity, then less of the trauma is passed on to the next generation and we're overall developing. Does that match your model?
I have a funny story about that. When I was a child, I was told by my mother, who did not like, and I think was afraid of cats, that I should look out for cats because when they arch their back, that means they're gonna bite you. And I was like, "Okay, that seems like an important fact." You collect these things up as a child, when you without experience, and you're getting it from other people. Like I saw one the other day said, "Somehow when I grew up, I grew up with the impression that quicksand was gonna be a much bigger problem than it actually turned out to be."
I can relate to that one actually.
Yeah, I love that. And, knowing someone that actually almost lost a friend to quicksand, that's another story.
There's quicksand in the Galisteo in Cerrillos.
There are places. They lost a big, huge tractor in the Galisteo
Uh-huh.
in quicksand, yeah. And I've had a friend who almost lost a horse in quicksand, which is scary. But what happened with me was I grew up and I was allergic to cats. And I could literally go into a room and I could not only tell if there was a cat there, I could tell if a cat had been there 2 weeks before. And I would get a histamine reaction, I'd get my eyes would water and I mean, and I'd get wheezy and I'd actually get an asthma attack. And which so years go on, this was a rule, right? And I had asthma that then became more generalized as like could be cold induced. Uh but mostly it was cats. Cats in real cold. If I went from real cold to real hot or something like that, they call it cold induced asthma. But So then I was in Alaska, staying in an apartment that had 3 cats in the wintertime, so it was all closed up, and, I was with one of my teachers who was a very good Chinese doctor, and I started to come down with, like, a generalized sickness, uh, exacerbated by the presence of these cats, and he wanted me as a dummy to throw around in a demonstration the next day, so he didn't want me to get sick. So, he did some Chinese medicine on me, some acupuncture that fixed that, and then subsequently, either from that or from the years of Purga, uh I got to the point where I could literally take a cat, which a cat just showed up on me, moved in, long-haired cat. I could bury my face in this cat and go, "Blah, blah, 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 blah." No reaction whatsoever.
He might have
So
reacted.
pardon?
He might have reacted.
The cat, well, yeah. Yeah. But so interesting, and the Tibetans, I think, are as far as medicine, is concerned, are people that understand this maybe better than Western medicine, the connection between mind and body and the medical aspects of that, because that's absolutely the case. And like a thing that might seem tangential, but I saw today was a test that a guy did. He went into a school, he gave the kids a test that he had made up that he said measured blooming intelligence, and he went and gave them the test, and he gave them their scores back, and he gave some kids very high scores and other kids not so high scores, and then he came back in a year, and he checked them out. Well, it turns out he made up this test just out of whole cloth. It was totally random who he said was scoring high and who wasn't. And when he came back and they tested the kids a year later, the kids that he said were high scorers, Sky scored 9 points higher on the IQ test than the other children who had been. And I remembered, one of my teachers, he always said to me, "Well, whatever you do, you're gonna have success." This was Peter. So, "Well, whatever, you're smart. Whatever you're gonna do, you're gonna have success." And I realized that, I did sort of onboard that as an is. Okay. And this is the human capacity with meaning, right? We can find meaning, but we also make meaning sometimes in that finding. And that seems like great. And we only think about finding good stuff, but we also can find false meaning, like the false meaning that's implied by trauma. You're not good enough. You deserve whatever happened, right? Well, this is all false meaning. This is that meaning machine just printing false paper here, right? And so that's why I say this is like a powerful, like jumping on a stallion. You have to know how to hold the reins, or you'll get run all over the place, right?
The stallion being trauma?
The stallion being the mind that wants to wordify and find meaning in everything, even if it's not there,
Mm.
you know? Like I can't remember the exact story, but I remember somebody asking a Zen master something like, "Why?" Like a why behind trauma, and his answer was, "No reason." And it wasn't that there wasn't something appropriate about the learning experience that this was providing to that person, because I do think that his worldview was that we have a glove in hand fit with our karma, and that is in fact what that is. But also that this idea to find meaning starts to load up all of this mental baggage that goes along with it, and sometimes we just need to take things as an is. So say, well, it is what it is. And that's that place of acceptance. And it's a place of pure experience. In Buddhism, we say we have this eightfold path. We talked about Padmasambhava, the lotus born one, and he's envisioned in a eight petaled lotus. And one of the eights that those petals represent are the eightfold path. And one of the first, typically given as the first of the stages of the eightfold path, is called right view. And right view means we want to see what actually is. We don't want to see it colored by our perceptions. We don't want that meaning brain to have just gone printing up a bunch of counterfeit cash,
Mm.
right? Because we want to see things like a camera. We wanna say, like there's 2 interpretations. Okay, there are 2 schools of Zen Buddhism. One is called Soto and one is called Rinzai, and that was the school that I was in. The way you know when you go into a Zendo, whether you're in a Soto sect or a Rinzai sect, is that if you're in a Soto sect, they all sit facing the wall. In the Rinzai sect, we call them the wall sitters, right? Because they sit looking at the wall. And the Rinzai, we all sit facing the center of the room. Well, there's one interpretation of that, that the original instruction was not that you should sit, looking at the wall, but that you should sit as a wall. That the wall is there and
Yeah,
it
big
just
interpretation.
big it's just impassive. Whatever happens in front of it, it remains the same and unchanged, and it just experiences it with no judgment, with no meaning mill churning away, overloading it, right? Just is.
Nonviolent communication tries to do that, right? Like the typical nonviolent communication, like a clearing statement, they call it, I think, or at least the conscious leadership group calls it a clearing statement, is when this happened, I felt this. And the story that I tell myself or my belief about that is this. And so separating the what really happened from my feelings, from the story, and then maybe I have a request or maybe right.
Right.
And so kind of breaking that into parts and making us more aware
Sure.
of yeah.
Yeah. Werner Erhard does that a little bit with the distinction is and shows up as.
Mhm.
So he would say, the chair is a chair, but I can use it to prop the door open, and then it's showing up as a doorstop. Or I could hit you with it, it would be showing up as a weapon. Or I could chop it up and burn it, it would be showing up as firewood. But the isness of it is somehow separate from all the different showing ups as. So you could say that under trauma, we sort of accept a showing up as of ourselves as an isness. And so when Reich says that those natural impulses are always deeper than the traumatic overlays, that's another way of saying that your isness is different and deeper and bigger than your shows up as. That's what I'm saying whenever I slap around Descartes for, and I know people are going to say, "Oh, you're falsely accusing him. You've done a straw man on Descartes," and it's true to some degree. It's true because he was just trying to prove that he was. He wasn't trying to prove the extent to which he was. But I pick a bone over that because it implies that there is an equality between the two eyes, the one that thinks, je pense, and the one that is, donc je suis, right? Therefore I am. And uh and it's that implication that I think is damaging. So what I'm always saying is I'm always wanting to point to the is you and not the shows up as you that was qualified by your story of things that haven't cleaned up yet.
Can you maybe talk more about these natural impulses that are underneath the trauma? Because I imagine the person who asked this question, or anybody, who's kind of asking themselves, "How do I get past this crap that's holding me back?" Um, how might we douse for, or let's say, sing to the natural impulses within ourselves, and how can we recognize them? And is there a like, I'm imagining the metaphor you used before of you can't force the flower to open, right? You have to
Mhm,
let the
mhm.
flower open. But this is not entirely a passive process either. There's also a cultivation that we're doing.
Because realization is involved with it. Yeah. Uh, well, you feel the trauma because it impinges on those natural impulses. People have the natural impulse to love and be loved. And that's if that's frustrated, you feel it as a frustration on top of that, right? So, uh It's like it's somewhat similar, I think, to the way that people have an intuitive understanding of what's right and what's wrong. Uh, or the way we used to say, Jorge used to say in ceremonies, that the thing about ceremonies is it's an opportunity for you to look at your life and see what's good and what's not good and to choose what's good. Well, what's good is underneath it. That is your impulse to be happy, your impulse to fulfill yourself, your impulse for your petals to unfold, for those things that are inside of yourself, the potentials and capacities to actually find expression. And so the way we know that there's junk on the windshield is because we can't see past it. But we know there's an outside world, and so that's why we know it's junk on the windshield. And there's a realization process that I mentioned before, because we don't always recognize the junk as junk. That's the first step in the process. Is you realize that's not a bird, that's a smudge on my windshield. That's why it keeps moving with my car. Wherever I look, there's the bird. Well, that's a good indication it's on your windshield, yeah. So so, uh I think we do the first step is things need to be brought into awareness, and life will do that on a time-released pattern. And that's why you start to feel, when the shoe fits, the foot is forgot. That's Chuangzi. Well, you're feeling the shoe, so that means it doesn't entirely fit, and that means that you also know what it's like when a shoe fits. And so, you have to go through that, and it's process, and you have to be patient with yourself. And like I say, these are koans. Every human life is a koan, and every human life is a unique koan. So other people's answers may not fit for your answers. And that's why I always want to say it's a process you go through. I can't give you an answer if it's a process oriented thing. You give yourself the process gives you the answer. And so, maybe we have to grow courage to look at things that are difficult for us to look at.
Mm,
Maybe we need to get over the false implications that we took on when we experienced whatever that trauma was. Maybe we have to start out by having that instinct that there's something rotten in Denmark. There's something fishy. I've taken a wooden nickel here somehow. I believed something about me that wasn't really true. And that's why when I try to operate it as if it is true, it's not fulfilling the inner me that wants to come out. And you need to but this is the only game in town, right? So it's something that's worthy of our attention, and yet we don't wanna get too tweaked out around it, because that won't help either. We have to work this out and process with both halves of our brain, you know? And it's learning, and I mean, I think it's the thing that gives you depth as a human being,
mm.
and an understanding of yourself, is to kinda go through all that and gnash the teeth when you need to.
Kind of like your reference in prior episodes to, if you ask yourself, "Who am I?" You reach enlightenment. Just drill down on that. That's asking for those deeper impulses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And there's generic impulses like the need or desire to love and be loved and feel connected, but each of us has our own flavor to those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, I was thinking about this today, and I was thinking about religion, actually. And that if we lose the semantic world labels and we pull ourselves out of that a little bit, and we try to see people's relationship with religion, all religions, somewhat generically, and we understand it as a human desire or drive reaching out for depth, reaching out for deeper experience, reaching out to know themselves, to know who they are. Uh, then, regardless of our perceived silliness of their semantic model of that effort, we need to respect that drive in humans. because along with that drive is the drive to be humane, the drive to be uh, uh, to be good with a capital G, and we need to like respect that wherever we find it, in whatever form we find it. And we can't get messed up on the labels because that's the thing, that's that deeper part of humanity that is the same with everybody. And that's like when we sing for the world, that's what we want to sing to, is that impulse of humanity to unfold. And so we want to respect that wherever we find it, in whatever shape we find that. If people are devout to that, to their model of that undertaking, we need to support that. You know, when the Dalai Lama talks about the necessity of all religions, and this is very close to what I'm talking about here, is that people have all these different paths to unfolding, and we just want to encourage that direction, regardless of the roadmap, as long as it's not overtly, you know, we got into the whole Mao and say, and there's that whole discussion around the reality of evil, which is a very deep and mysterious topic. Uh, but still, within that, this is the other side of that same conversation. We have to learn to respect all of those positive aspects, no matter where they're seated. And those are the little embers and the coals that you know, we talk about the wind moving into places, that are difficult to move. Well, that's where we want to send that encouragement and that intensity, that this is what we want to see flame up, is that human impulse. And if we root ourselves in that impulse, then we'll start to recognize it, even though it's dressed up differently. Like, when we started the Africa project, it's called the New Village Alliance. When we started that, one of my surprises was, now I like to think of myself as not naive at all, and I understand that there are very low resolution models, and I know that I am susceptible to those as much as everybody else. But I was surprised at the degree to which both liberal and conservative people really cared about other people that they didn't know. Like, they were perceptive to suffering, and they had compassion, and their worldviews were completely diametrically opposed. If you
Yeah,
talk to them politically, or you
Johnson
talk to them.
has like a whole model for this. There's like a morality handprint, and I think he identified 6 or 7 continua of kind of sliders, right? Moral sliders, and like there's caring is one of them, and he did a bunch of research on conservatives and liberals to see how they metered out on each of those sliders. And he did find that all of the values mattered to both conservatives and liberals, but which they prioritized was different consistently for one group versus the other. And
Curious.
he's got a good TED talk on it.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
And, and I guess my point here is that those are the levels, like, when we're not trauma impacted, we have an easier time getting to those natural impulses that we will naturally harmonize around, right? And so that, we're growing up together, and that's what world history is. And but trauma is a part of that story, right? And this idea of part of the bodhisattvic vow is to understand the isness, the of the kalpas upon kalpas upon, which in which we have engendered suffering for one another. Kalpa in the Buddhist model is a huge long period of time. I'll try to dig out how long a kalpa is, and but it's long, and uh, you don't want to be waiting in line at the bank for kalpas, right? We've been we've been doing this to each other a long time, which means we've been doing it to ourselves for a long time, right? It's the same statement. So why are we doing this to ourselves, right? Well, because there's stuff on the windshield, and the way we're gonna work around that, work through that stuff on the windshield is by those underneath impulses actually, flourishing and pushing aside all that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a nice way to look at it. So, you've talked to a lot of people about trauma, and a question that comes up for me is how different is that conversation when the person sitting across from you is a teenager or in their 20s or in their 30s or in their 40s? Like, because I think we kind of covered that the way we work through trauma is not an incident, rather, it's a life process.
yeah, yeah,
And so so the same material comes up again and again, but in new contexts and in new ways and where we have new perspective and therefore purchase on it.
right,
Um, and so, it can be challenging to talk to somebody who's in an early stage of that. Um, and
absolutely.
and you can see where purchase could be available if they could just dot dot dot.
Yeah,
But still they're needing support, they're needing input.
sure, yeah. Well, I used to work in the adolescent psych ward and, in the behavioral sciences center is what we called it, and also in the family recovery center. And I worked with adults and with adolescents. And in those days, which was the 90s, adolescent mental health was a growth industry. If I was going to be parsing a society for symptoms, this would be one of them. But that's why there was a whole area of the hospital that was devoted to the family recovery center, which was owned by a church. Like a national franchise church, I don't remember which, but I thought, "Wow, that's curious." Uh, but so I was dealing with adolescents, and adolescents are in a very unique, condition in terms of this, because there's an incredible amount of energy there, and this is the time of coming to sexual maturity. So, if you think about it this way, do you ever try to go follow a kid around for a day and just physically do everything that that kid does in that day, right? And I've heard that they had NVL and NFL players try to do this. And there's no way, right? So what's happening is an incredible amount of energy is going through a young body to build the body and to basically be an insane midget. A lot of energy there, right? Well, then when they hit, puberty, there's a major shift in the economy, the energetic economy of the physiology of the body. And now this energy that was put to building the body, well, now the body's built. So now what about all that energy? And this is where men and women are very different, right? Because one of the ways that a woman's body regulates is with menses. And so there's an amount of energy that goes through that ask any woman. There's an energetic thing that's happening there. Whereas men are likely that energy was used wrestling tigers and banging heads with Neanderthals and, whatever story you want of that. Men were clearly had that energy focused outwards. Whereas a woman it might use that energy to build an entire another human with. Just to give you an idea of quantities of energy. So young males have an incredible amount of energy that was meant largely probably for saber-toothed tigers, right? Or something like that. Uh, which is probably connected with why, one male can generate a lot of babies, as opposed to a female, because a lot of those males were saber-toothed tiger bait. It's probably right. So anyway, this I think connects with when we look at we look at the prison populations and we look at delinquency and we look at that. Clearly, there is an energy with young males that has to go somewhere, and society doesn't always regulate. Doesn't always give us a good place where that regulation process can go on. So, like when I was a kid in those age, I was doing a lot of martial arts, but I was also climbing the Adirondack Mountains, and I was, out winter camping and doing a lot of very physical stuff that's sort of directed, like, the saying we'd have when you get a horse that's got a lot of energy and he wants his own head. Well, you run him uphill in the mud, right? Well, that's what sometimes some young men need is some running uphill in the mud, and that's what the military used to serve that purpose. It takes that energy and it puts it in a place where it's not going to be destructive. So uh, these conversations are very chapter specific for sure. With adolescents, I feel like there's a lot of anxiousness, not necessarily anxiety, but maybe anxiety, but a lot of anxiousness. And I think at those ages, kids can feel like they're really being held in, and of course they know everything, and they want to get out there and try stuff. And personally, I think that if we that our education system infantilizes children. It's a whole topic here. But I think that we were actually better served maybe back in the day when we'd followed our parents around and learned how to do what they did. Because children, they want to imitate adults. They don't, kids don't imitate kids playing, kids imitate adults playing. That's not for no reason. And so, I feel like if we were properly integrated to how life works, by the time we got to that age, it might not hit us with this sort of the shock that it does. And that maybe we've been nursemaided too long in the public school system, and we haven't had enough actual hands-on the doing of things. And so that has an energetic impact. I'm not so much talking about that on the intellectual level, I'm talking about on the energetic impact that has to do with balances, and the consciousness rides on that energy, right? That the energy of the body. In Chinese medicine, we would say the 5 organ systems are the foundation that consciousness rests on.
Mhm.
So 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 yeah, you're at a different stage, when you're at the stage of, exploring the world and getting a foundation for yourself, which are the 2 opposite impulses. uh, you've got a lot of figuring out to do, and you've got all this energy under your saddle, and, so that's a different problem than when you're tangled up in the middle of life, and you've made important life decisions, and you've set the stage now for things that might or might not fit for this chapter or the next chapter, and then when we experience trauma, and I've said this before, if it was a broken arm, then people would go and they get it fixed immediately because it's really obvious you got this deformed thing. And if somebody can go in and fix it, then you're going to look like everyone else. So we have a strong social impetus to want to look like everybody else. But if it's an emotional broken arm, that might be more easily kind of hidden away. And we can kind of maybe pick and choose where the situations where that dysfunction might show and largely keep it under wraps. And that doesn't always serve us well, right? So yeah, where you are in the chapter, if you didn't fix the broken leg or the broken arm right away, you might have kind of healed up that way. And, if it's your arm, then sometimes they have to re-break the arm to get it to set it right, and that's even worse than the original break, right? So that's why I say there is some impetus to wanna fix things, and this is what I got the old way when we were living in tribes. The tribe could be right on it and could fix it, and that constituted taking care of people. But we don't have those apparatus in place now,
Mm.
and so But so there is this process that you have to go through. And if it's later in life and you're dealing with stuff that happened way earlier in life, you're going to see that you've adjusted to this in ways that you might want to unadjust to come back to wholeness. And again, that's a process. Be patient with yourself. You're an organic thing. You're not an object like a machine. We can't just change parts out. You're organic. But you're also under the influence of mind, which your machine is not. Curse at it as you might, right?
Under the influence of mind?
Of mind. So that means that you can change the software. You can understand that you had a misunderstanding and adjust that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I guess I imagine that, having a conversation about the true human impulses are in there underneath the trauma might be a less accessible concept for somebody earlier in that development compared to later on, when they've seen a few cycles and worked through it some. Um,
yeah. Although with age, people can create quite a divergent semantic world for themselves.
right.
They can paddle their boat pretty far out from shore. And unless someone's had a very dysfunctional, beginning, with youngsters, there's often still enough, closeness to the beginning of things that they can kinda be the natural impulse of growth. We can grow around a lot of things that, like, you can literally take half of the brain out of a six-year-old child, and the body will adapt, and the brain will reseparate, but by the time you're 12 or 15, that you no longer have that capacity.
Mhm,
So there is, there's advantages, disadvantages, everything's a trade-off, I guess.
mhm,
But we definitely do wanna prevention is the most important thing, and if we the more we understand these things, the more we hopefully don't engender them to the next generations. And then, awareness is the step after that, and then having patience and compassion for ourselves as
mhm,
well. And often I find that people are so hard on themselves that they make things 10 times more difficult. And, so if you need to hear this, I give you permission to relax on yourself a little bit. Understand you're organic. You're going through processes, and it's natural to experience trauma and to recover from trauma. And we're built for that. So, you just have to move forward.
cool.
Yeah.
It's always nice for me to hear that too, even having done a lot of work, so thanks for the reminder.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I tell myself that too,
Yeah.
you know. And uh and I think that does point on, we our last conversation was on that dependence, independence, and interdependence. And as always, whenever we have a conversation after we have it, my head pops for the next few hours. Oh, and then there, right? And this gets us back to that mystery of interdependence, because that we do serve a purpose for each other in not just causing the trauma, but also in working it out, and hopefully milking it for all it's worth. You know, and so the more we've been through that, the more we can be there for others who need that. That's part of that Carl Rogers empathic listening, and just that being there-ness. We are going through all of this together.
Mm, good. Thanks,
Good to
Brian.
remember. Sounds good. I guess we'll call it a day for this episode.
Yeah. And you can always find show notes at foolsandsagespodcast.com. And thanks for joining.
Yeah. And tell your friends.